Want to keep up with the latest LEGO Mega 96.1 videos? Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Hello everyone, LEGO Mega 96.1 here with another video. And welcome back to another On This Day in History. I talk about Disney a lot on my channel, haven't I? Apparently I do. But for the sake of this video, I want to go over the movie that actually launched Disney to stardom, and actually started the movie-making business. Now, the movie I'm talking about is On This Day in History video is of course the premiere of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Released in 1937, on December 21st to be more precise, which is the winter solstice, Disney premiered Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the first full-length animated cartoon movie. Now, this was relatively new back at that time, but you're probably wondering, how did this movie ever get to be in the first place? Well, I'll tell you. All this began back in the year 1812, long before Walt Disney, long before any of this came to be. The story of Snow White actually dates back to the 1812 German fairy tale told by the Brothers Grimm, or the Grimm brothers. But the story of Snow White is pretty much straightforward, everyone knows it. An evil queen wants to be the quote-unquote fairest in the land, or the fairest one of all, depending on what variation of the story you read. As long as the mirror answered true, saying the queen is the fairest one of all, Snow White is safe. But however, one day, one fateful day, mind you, the mirror said it's Snow White who is the fairest one of all. The queen, jealous of all this, orders the huntsman to kill her. But the hunter is so blown away with how beautiful she is, he couldn't bring himself to kill her. But what did the queen want from Snow White anyway? Well, not only want her dead, but she also wanted the heart, the liver, and the lungs of Snow White, which she ate for soup. Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. This was back in 1812, told by the Germans. Yeah, the Brothers Grimm. That is dark, let me tell you. So, the hunter tells Snow White to run and hide. She hides in the cottage that belongs to 7 dwarfs. Now, depending on what variation of the story where you read on Snow White, the names of the dwarves tend to differ. Like one that I heard of, they named it after the 7 days in the week. You know, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Those days. But when the queen discovered that Snow White is alive, she decided to kill her herself. 3 separate attempts were made to kill her. One of them being a comb, but that was foiled by the dwarves. The other being a bodice, which was again foiled by the dwarves. And the other was the poisoned apple. Yeah, 3 separate attempts, but one was successful. When the dwarves tried to bring Snow White to life, and again, they couldn't do it. So what they did, they fashioned a coffin of glass and gold and kept eternal watch by her side. So her Prince Charming actually found Snow White in the glass coffin, and she just gave her a kiss, and they're about to take her away to bury her. But before they would go on their way, one of the guys actually slipped, and a piece of the poisoned apple fell out of Snow White's mouth, and she was alive again. So in other words, one simple jolt, and I'm alive. I don't know how it turns out, but it's a fairy tale. It's not science. So Snow White, seeing her Prince Charming, decided to marry her. But when the queen discovered that this woman is marrying a prince, she went to see for herself. Now, again, depending on what variation of the story that you read, the death of the queen tends to differ. Some say that she was so angry she turned into dust and disappeared. Others say she was sucked into a mirror where it was never seen again. While others say that she was forced to wear hot shoes and dance until she died. Crazy, isn't it? And that's how the story of Snow White came to be. Now, when Walt Disney was around, she actually saw a silent film of Snow White when he was just a boy. And he figured, why doesn't he do something like that? Well, after he founded the Walt Disney Company back in 1923, which was working on cartoons, and yes, I did cover that in my On This Day in History video, link in the description, he decided to bring his animators together and went over the storyboard phase of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which they were going to adapt in animated form. But originally, before they were going to do Snow White, they were going to produce a live action version of Alice in Wonderland. But however, Universal did their own. It was All Star. Now, whether you go online and search up the live action version of Alice in Wonderland, you will find several pictures of these some behind the scenes stuff. I'm not kidding. Now, when the press got word of this movie that Walt was working on, they labeled it as Disney's Folly. Why? Well, think about it this way. People wouldn't sit for long enough for an hour and a half cartoon because the bright colors would hurt their eyes. However, Walt and his people thought differently. Now, if Disney's Folly did succeed, there wouldn't be no Walt Disney World or Disneyland or any of the stuff linking to Disney today. However, Walt risked everything to put Snow White on the big screen. And he even had to mortgage his house to get the money he needed to make the movie. Now, Walt actually blew his budget. His budget was $250,000, eventually spending nearly $1.5 million, an unheard of amount back in the 1930s. Now, like I said, he even had to mortgage everything, even his own house, just to finish the movie. I kid you not. Now, Walt was, like I said, he risked everything to put Snow White on the big screen. Now, during the production, Walt was working on cartoons as he was before. One of the shorts he worked on was Goddess of Spring, which was the sort of a testing phase for animating humans. Now, one of the things that was difficult back in those times was animating humans because of the way we move, the way we act, the way we talk. But animating cartoon characters was another story. Now, you're probably wondering, how did they use animation? Well, you may remember rotoscoping, right? Have you heard of it? Well, rotoscoping is where they take a clip from a movie and they actually traced over the certain character that they want and added some details to it. That's how rotoscoping works. In fact, you can find it pretty much everywhere in various forms of social media, whether it's video games or even in Japanese animation, in pretty much all over. It's crazy. Now, they even used a thing called the multiplaying camera. Now, what it is, they take a scene, and each scene was painted on layers of glass. Now, the multiplaying camera, this is a massive piece of equipment. It allowed the artist to move layers of artwork at different speeds, creating a 3D effect in a 2D world. It was a revolutionary piece of technology that forever stapled with Disney animation. In fact, the multiplaying camera was still in use, even to this very day. That's crazy. Pretty cool. But you're probably wondering, and you probably heard this before, Disney's Folly. Why did it call it that? Well, before the premiere, the industry was convinced that the movie would fail, and they believed the bright colors would hurt the audience's eyes and that the audience would never care for a fairy tale for 80 minutes. However, Walt proved them wrong. Now, when they were working on the story of Snow White, every animator came up with a name for the dwarfs. One of them come up being Deafy, Jumpy, Dizzy, Hickey, Wheezy, Baldy, and Gabby. Just those names a few. But it wasn't until Walt come up with names that forever stapled the Disney version of the movie. One of them being Doc, Bashful, Sleepy, Sneezy, Happy, Dopey, and Grumpy. Those names of the dwarves was that forever stapled Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, I've actually seen the documentary on how they made the movie, and it was amazing. Now, as for the queen herself, man, talk about on an actual design. And of course, of her transform. And of course, let's not forget her transformation to an old hag is just friggin' awesome. A look like that will give Darth Sidious a run for his money. Now, Lucy Laverne provided the voice of the Wicked Queen. Now, how did she do the voice of the old hag? Well, the actress reported removing her dentures before recording. Hence the reason why we got that the voice for the old witch. Crazy, I know. Now, I did explain the story of Snow White before, but Walt settled on the poisoned apple because it would make a whole lot of sense. Because the reason why, well, animating the human back in the 1930s and even the 40s was difficult. Now, the voice actress who played Snow White, she was outstanding too. And she still had that voice even after the movie premiered. Now, the movie premiered, and it was exactly the same as it was in the Grimm Brothers fairy tale, but with some differences. There were songs added like One Song, or Whistle While You Work, Hi Ho, the Silly Song, the Washing Song, or even Someday My Prince Will Come. Those songs forever became a staple for Disney. And yeah, I did see the movie, be grown up. I barely remember it, but watching it now, it's still a good movie. But I know you're probably thinking, what are my thoughts on the live action version? I know this may generate some debate, but hear me out. The live action version isn't really that bad. It's okay. Sure, it could use some fixing up here and there, but overall, it's really not that bad. It did pay homage to the animated movie, like a lot of callbacks to the movie, but it's okay. Let's go with that. But how did all this? Well, approximately 2 million individual sketches and printings were made for the film, and about 250,000 and actually appearing on the screen. Now, during that time, gags and sequences were either added or cut during the production. Now, this is a process that Walt called plussing. Now plussing for the Disney company is still in use. Now, there's an episode called The Plausible Impossible. It was an episode that you can find on Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, in which you can find it on Disney Plus today. There was a soup eating sequence for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but it was cut because it didn't add into the story. Now, the soup eating sequence has to do with the dwarves and the way they were eating their soup, slurping it, as it were. Now, there was another deleted scene that has to do with the witch with the cauldron, making the potion for the poisoned apple. I've actually seen that deleted scene, and it was amazing. But why did they cut it? They should have added into the story. Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but hey, if the movie does get a remaster, they should totally add that in. And there was another deleted scene where the dwarves were making a bet for Snow White. But again, it was cut because of the budget back at the time. And there was another scene which was also cut, and has to do with the dwarves arguing about Snow White staying in the cottage. Now, the reason why it wasn't fully animated is because it was in preliminary sketches, which was concept art, or which is another way of saying it's concept art in Disney. Now, for the live action version, and to make the movies more realistic, Walt filmed live actors like Marge Champion to perform the scene, and so the animators could study the physics of their movements. Something that was still in use, something that's still in use even today. Rather you play a video game or even watch an animated in movies, rather it's CG or even in 2D animated, all that can be traced back to Disney. Now, the differences being back then and for Snow White into today's modern animated feature. Now, the budget for Snow White was $1.49 million. But for a modern animated feature, between 150 to 200,000 and 200,000. Now, the differences between Snow White and today's modern animated feature has to do with the differences. The budget for Snow White was $1.49 million. But for today's modern animated film is 150 to $200 million. Now, the production time for Snow White back then was 3 years. For an animated feature, 4 to 6. Now, what I mean by modern day? Well, Snow White back then, including those that were animated by Disney, they were all hand-drawn. Now, I love hand-drawn animation. CG and even 3D, I can live with. But hand-drawn is the best. You can actually see the artist bringing the characters to life. But for today's animated feature, they either use CG or 3D modeling. But nowadays, with artificial intelligence, they just make the videos themselves. Now, the revenue back in 1939 and 1937 and 38 was $8 million. But for today, his modern animated feature, $500 million to $1 billion plus. Yeah, let that budget sink in a little bit. But however, when the movie premiered back in 1937, it was an instant hit. Everyone loved it. People laughed and cried and even cheered for Walt Disney for putting on such a marvelous display. But what do you mean by crying? Well, imagine you're in a theater and you're coming up to the scene where the dwarfs were holding a funeral for Snow White. Everyone in that theater was crying. They were crying for a beloved cartoon princess. And you could just feel the emotion of the dwarfs. They were not only crying, they were sobbing, bawling their eyes out over the fact that they lost the only woman, an only friend that has ever come into their lives. And even Grumpy cried for her. But when the prince came in, it was a standing ovation. And Walt Disney's folly became a triumph. In fact, think about it this way. If Snow White did fail, without that movie, we wouldn't have the Disney parks, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Pixar, or anything else that has to do with animation. Not bad for a folly, right? But all that aside, I love this movie. I still watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to this very day. Well, I have a soft spot for princesses. Don't judge me. Why? Well, I have a video, which I'll put a link in the description below, in which my aunt did record, mind you, of me meeting Snow White at Epcot back in 2016. And I know what I'm going to say is kind of cringy here, so just bear with me on this one. In 2010, I was down in Walt Disney World with my family. My mother, my father, and my two brothers, one older, one younger. We were at Magic Kingdom and we were filming the Main Street Electrical Parade, which was a nightly parade which Disney does once in a while. And they were coming up to Snow White. And what happened was she just blew me a kiss. And you're supposed to blow a kiss back. But for me, I just stood there and record. So she came up to me, not me. She wasn't being mean. She wasn't being mean or anything. And she told me, I blew you a kiss, where's one for me? So I just went and she was off. And for me, that was sort of embarrassing. Throughout the rest of the trip, I kid you not, I hid from Snow White. And I thought about paying her back, but after seeing the movie, I changed my tune. Well, it was a badge of honor. And I know you're going to be saying, and it was actually kind of nice, but to me, it was embarrassing. And again, and I was a kid I was a young teenager at the time, and I didn't know what I was thinking. So there's basically that. But like I said, without Disney Snow White, we wouldn't have the Disney theme parks, or Marvel wouldn't have been bought by Disney, or even Lucasfilm, or we wouldn't have anything that has to do with Disney today. So think about Walt Disney and the movie. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And that concludes this video. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like this, including many other videos that I've done on my channel, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to my channel, and turn the bell notifications so that way you can be notified when I upload the next video. And as always, this is Lego Maker 96 1 signing off.